There's consensus among American security officials and scholars that China seeks to undermine U.S. leadership in the world. But internal operations of the Chinese Communist Party are opaque, and debates are lively in the West over the CCP's true motivations and dogma, whether it's intensely monolithic or an organization plagued by secretive infighting and internal power struggles beneath the rule of Chinese President Xi Jinping. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at The Washington Times, and for this edition of the Threat Status Influencer series, we're in Palo Alto, California at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and we're lucky to be joined by Glenn Tiffert, a preeminent scholar on the Chinese Communist Party's history. He's written extensively on the CCP's ambitions, including its efforts to globalize Beijing's authoritarian censorship regime. He's currently the co-chair of the Hoover Institution's program on the U.S., China, and the world. Glenn Tiffert, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Guy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's jump right into this. What do you see as the defining characteristics of the Xi Jinping era in China, and what do U.S. foreign and security policymakers need to understand about that and why it matters?
So I see two principally. Number one, it is reasserting the primacy of the party across all of China. There was a period of time where the party began to loosen its control, and actually this is the period that liberated the energies of the Chinese people to achieve everything they've achieved in the last 50 years. But in many ways you can look at Xi Jinping, if there's a kind of rule of thumb way of describing him, as an anti-Gorbachev figure. He understood that as China was liberalizing, as people were making money, as firms were globalizing, they needed the party less and less. The party was less central to their lives, the party was less dominant, and the party was also rotting from within because of access to capital and corruption. And so when he came to power, it was about reviving the party, reasserting its dominance and centrality, reasserting its control over society, and reasserting discipline within the party, so that the party would not go and exit the stage of history as the Soviet Communist Party once did. So that's the first. The second is reconciling modern contemporary China's own identity with its historic past. For decades, the Chinese Communist Party was focused on the future. It was about repudiating the past. That's the whole point of having had a revolution. But under Xi Jinping, he really took a process that began after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, which is to revive an interest in the Chinese past and accelerated it tremendously. And this really is his opportunity to kind of bulk up the fact that no one really believes in communism anymore, but if he can connect the Chinese people to a sense of their own past, it inoculates them against influence from the West, particularly the influence of Western democracy.
There's debate about whether Xi's vision and this so-called Xi Jinpingism or Xi Jinping thought is deeply communist or not. Right. And really this idea that Xi sees himself as an incarnation of Mao Zedong in the modern era almost. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think he's clearly the most dominant figure in China since Mao Zedong, but in many ways he's really different. Mao was a radical whose legitimacy and authority depended on the fact that he won the revolution. Xi Jinping doesn't have that. He's insecure. He's actually deeply conservative. Mao loved assembling 2 million people in front of him in Tiananmen Square in rallies, like, for example, during the Cultural Revolution, and everyone quaked before him. Xi Jinping's terrified of his own people. In fact, he does everything he can do to lock them down. And so in that respect, he's really different, though he's still a dominant figure. And Xi Jinping talks about reviving sort of recognition of China's excellent traditional past. This is not the 20th century past, this is the imperial past. Xi is trying to elevate himself as a kind of philosopher king, and Chinese leaders typically do this so that they not only have political authority, but they have a kind of moral legitimacy as a great sage. Mao did this as a great theorist, and Xi Jinping is setting himself up in this way with Xi Jinping thought. And in fact, he's the only person other than Mao who qualifies in CCP jargon to have thought. So he's setting himself up really as an equal to Mao, which no one has dared do before.
Interesting. Back to the practical side of, I don't know if you'd call it revanchism or this kind of rollback of Deng Xiaoping era, almost capitalist style reforms, and an expansion of state control and CCP control over the economy. Is that part of what you're describing?
Absolutely, and I think the most, I think, evocative example to point to is the Alibaba IPO, in which Alibaba announced, and Didi announced it was going to do an IPO. Alibaba's Jack Ma really challenged the authority of Xi Jinping as the party, and the party is one of China's richest business people, in many senses self-made, sitting on top of a vast private capital empire. And the party cut him down to size because he got too big for his britches. And this was a moment where Xi Jinping said, you know what, I am cutting down the entire private sector. The party is in control here. And since then, we've seen a significant rollback of the independence of the private sector in China.
Let's look inside the CCP and how it operates, and that idea of a monolith. Are there divisions in the CCP in the decision-making process? Is it a monolith? And if there are divisions, who are the divisions amongst?
Right. I think this gets to your first question about what I think our policymakers should appreciate more deeply about China. Just because it's a one-party state, an authoritarian state, doesn't mean that there isn't a rich, active layer of politics happening just beneath the surface. It's just harder to see. It's not visible because the party projects that monolith, that centrality, that unity to the world. But there is vigorous debate within the party. At the moment, Xi Jinping represents one pole, and that is the party's in command, ideological discipline is in command, control over the economy and society is in command. But there are those people who dominated the conversation 15 years ago. They're still there. They argue for more engagement in the world. They argue for more liberalization. They argue for a less confrontational attitude with the United States. It's just they're very much on the back foot right now in China.
Let's drill into external power projection. You've written about what you've described as Beijing's efforts to try and globalize its authoritarian censorship regime. What are you referring to?
As you probably know, China is a very tightly controlled media environment. Well, and so China has decided that it wants to tell its story to the world, and it's done that by assembling a giant unitary media empire to project its messages globally. And it does that by buying media time in global markets, by offering satellite services subsidized or free of charge around the global south, by offering its wire services around the world to compete with AP and others on price. And if you're a newsroom, for example, in a poorer country which can't afford AP or Reuters or Agence France-Presse, and China offers you a service for free, then there are very strong economic incentives for you to take the China perspective. And so they basically end up projecting their view of the world into other mouthpieces that end up getting disseminated around the world. So that's one way in which they do it. A second way in which they do it is they actually control the way China is discussed within the Chinese diaspora. And that's through intimidation, that's through surveillance, that's through penetration of diaspora groups to control narratives and to make diaspora groups, the Chinese diaspora is just as diverse and rich as any group of people. But the Chinese Communist Party understands that ethnic Chinese outside of China have historically always been a source of inspiration for revolution within China. So they have a very strong interest in controlling how China is spoken about outside. And so they project their surveillance into the Chinese communities globally by surveilling them and intimidating them. And then the third bit is China is turning off the world's access to its own data. So if you look at economic data, for example, that financial firms use to do due diligence to understand whether a firm is worth investing in or not, they're adjusting that data because they don't want us to understand what's really happening in China. They want us to accept their version of the narrative on faith.
This would be referred to as the battle for global data dominance.
Yes.
Do you think that China is winning that battle right now with the West, with the United States?
China has a really aggressive play here. And I think unless we mobilize ourselves and adopt policies domestically, but also internationally, to understand the totality of the challenge that it poses, there is the danger that it wins it. And it's not just in the US market, but it's globally. The Biden administration announced in an executive order an effort to study the data implications of electric vehicles. It isn't just data with financial data, it isn't just data in academic data, it's the data that embedded devices, Internet of Things devices that are in for example, our digital cameras, in our drones, in our water sprinklers are worth taking a hard look at because Where does that data go? What kind of privacy protections do we have? What kind of legal regimes govern that? We face this a little bit with regard to TikTok, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes the solutions are not purely, sometimes the best solutions are solutions that apply across the board to everyone in the United States.
Let's jump from that to how China is achieving, and the CCP is achieving some influence in U.S. academia and universities. Of course, we had a lot of talk of Confucius institutes. That were on college campuses. Many of them have been closed by U.S. government intervention efforts and pressure on universities. How do you see China manifesting influence on American universities?
Well, this is a controversial topic, and you ask anyone who works in this world and they have their own perspective informed by their own direct experience. My own academic training was on the humanities and social sciences side. But if you talk to a scientist, their China is a completely different country, and their experiences are radically different. Why? Because those in the humanities, like historians or social scientists, like political scientists and economists, have independent stories that often challenge China's narratives about itself and its role in the world. We tell inconvenient truths. They want to silence us. They want to censor us. The scientists, on the other hand, have science and technology that China desperately wants. Their involvement in politics is often minimal. And so they are welcomed with red carpets, and the China that they see and experience is radically different. And I work very closely with the scientific community, convincing them that their China and my China are the same place, and that to some extent they are being seduced by a China that wants access to the technologies and sciences that they bring to apply towards ends that are not compatible with U.S. interests and U.S. values. That takes a lot of persuasion to say, you know, let me share my China with you. And I have deep affection for China. I've worked there, I've studied there, I've lived there for many, many years, but the current government is taking it very much in the wrong direction.
The current government in Beijing.
And the current government in Beijing, that's right. And so convincing, I think, large segments of the American academic community, there's now a consciousness that China is a challenge, unlike many of our traditional partners. Look, for 50 years, all of our traditional research partners were other liberal democracies, if not treaty allies like Japan or the NATO countries. China's the outlier here, and we've not adapted our mindset and our systems of managing research for a country that is a Leninist one-party state that has a really different view of the world than we do, and treats human rights really differently.
On China's broader foreign policy in the Belt and Road Initiative, it's more than 10 years old now. How do you take stock of it? Has it been a success for China, or is it struggling and it's a predatory lending system that's collapsing on itself?
So if you look at the Belt and Road narrowly, I think it's a ticking time bomb. China has lent far more money than it possibly will ever recover. And so those debts will simply never be paid. Those assets are in countries that simply can't afford to maintain them, let alone pay the interest on the loans. And you're seeing extreme debt distress around the world. So China keeps rolling over that debt because it's a foreign policy kind of public relations disaster for it to go wrong. So in the narrowest sense, I think it's not played well for China economically, but politically it's reaped really big dividends. Because look, a lot of the world desperately needs basic investment.
Particularly in the global south.
Yeah, particularly in the global south, Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, even the Middle East, in Egypt and Latin America. And unfortunately, the United States and Europe, Japan are not providing the capital and the investment that those countries need. China has stepped into that vacuum. So that's a wake-up call to us that we need to be doing more in that corner of the world. China is assembling a global coalition of sympathetic allies for the day when, if there's a conflict between the US and China, it can call on them to vote in international institutions, to have the weight of global opinion come down on its side. And if that scenario plays out, we might find ourselves really in a small minority of nations and feeling rather alone. So we've got a lot of work to do there.
Glenn Tiffert, totally interesting, very insightful. Thank you so much for joining me for this edition of the Threat Status Influencer Series.
Thank you, Guy.
And thank you once again to the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I'm Guy Taylor. Until next time.